here. Let's get started. First, just a quick word about our firm. Venable is a large firm. We're actually celebrating our 125th anniversary this year. We've got offices throughout the United States with about 900 lawyers. Jeremiah and I, we sit in the DC office here. We're part of the FDA regulatory law team. Just a quick word on my background. I've been a healthcare attorney for about 20 years. I started out as a litigator. I've spent some time on the Hill. And most recently, I was with the U.S. Department of Defense. It's now part of the Defense Health Agency, advising the Army Surgeon General on medical product development immediately before I joined Venable. Our practice here is pretty broad, and I'll tell you more about that in just a second, but I'd also like to give Jeremiah a chance to briefly introduce himself as well.
Yeah, hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm thrilled that you're here. Jeremiah Kelly, a partner in the FDA group here in Washington, D.C. At Venable. I spent 8 years in the commissioner's office at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. I was in the chief counsel's office there, as well as 12 plus years as the senior FDA regulatory law attorney for all the R&D elements of the Department of Defense, including the U.S. Army Medical Research and Development Command. Both of us advise the Joint Program Executive Office for Chem Biodefense. So thrilled that you're here, really excited about today's topic.
And here's just a quick map of our practice because we get this question a lot. What do you FDA regulatory attorneys do? So this is just a quick sketch. This is kind of a neat topic today because we're going to be touching on several of these issues that overlap lots of these areas. But this is really just for future reference. And here's a quick roadmap. So this is going to be a content-driven presentation. We're going to cover several different categories of information, and we actually are going to start with what we think are the most important takeaways for guiding a successful medical R&D collaboration with the U.S. government. After that, we're going to provide a little bit of information about the different types of FDA-regulated medical products, some information about expedited approval mechanisms, and then finally, looping it all back around to the contract again, we'll have some additional information at the end about USG contracting considerations. Okay, so our starting point for all of this is that this is a difficult space. So FDA-regulated product development is hard for most folks. If you've got a beautiful mind, maybe it's a little bit easier. But then on top of that, when you add in the federal government collaboration, now you've got two systems that are layered on top of each other. So, much like our friend here, Killian Murphy, there's a lot of opportunity there, but there's also a lot of balls to keep in the air. The good news is that, and Jeremiah and I have seen this throughout our careers, partnerships with the U.S. government can really be a tremendous springboard for product developers. So when you've got a good one, you can have a lot of synergy. And it's just amazing to see what's happened with some of these products and very encouraging.
Yeah, I'll jump in just to say that Justin and I have both been part of very large teams doing medical product development. I think we've contributed to about 40 products that have been approved, licensed, cleared, or authorized by the agency. And a lot of that was done in public-private partnerships through either the Department of Defense or HHS BARDA, with whom we worked for 3+ years during Operation Warp Speed and the COVID response. So it really is the opportunity for the private sector to rely on the non-dilutive funding, of course, that's what a lot of folks are interested in, but also the expertise and the regulatory teams that are built into a lot of the R&D enterprise across the federal government. These are just a few of the organizations that our clients partner with. We have a lot of experience and relationships with these organizations, some on the HHS side, like HHS BARDA, the National Institutes of Health, ARPA-H. But then within the Department of Defense, you have what is now the Defense Health Agency, the former components of the U.S. Army Medical Research and Development Command, grants and cooperative agreement programs through the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program. We mentioned JPEO, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, JSTO, DTRA, and DARPA. There's so many DoD entities that are involved in R&D. And so this is an attractive space. The questions that we're aiming to answer today really are at the nexus of the regulatory framework and also how one partners with the US government. And also, one of the things that is important to level set is that not all government agencies use the same types of legal vehicles or agreement types to partner. There are grants and cooperative agreements that are used kind of across the government. A lot of R&D elements, including BARDA and DoD, use other transaction agreements or OTAs. But even within their OTA practices in the relative federal enterprise, they're actually different statutory authorities. So there are different ways that each organization uses a two-party, a bilateral OTA, which is negotiated between the private sector and the government directly. Across the government, there are a number of OTA consortiums like the Medical Technology Enterprise Consortium, the Medical Suburban Defense Consortium. BARDA has recently built the RRPV, the Rapid Response Partnering Vehicle, and the BioMap Consortia. There's other really interesting R&D authorities that a lot of people don't know about. Commercial Solutions Offering, for example, is almost a broad agency-like ability for the government to acquire specific R&D products with a very limited competitive procedure. There's experimental supply authorities that the DoD has, for example, that are completely outside the Competition and Contracting Act. And then we have the tech transfer vehicles, things like cooperative research and development agreements. I think it's fair to say Justin and I have negotiated every species of these upside down and backwards. And we've done, in many cases, hundreds of these. And so we really do sit at the nexus of these two kind of spheres of legal complexity, but it's actually really kind of a thoroughly enjoying area of legal practice, but it is often very complex. And so these are just a few of the species of legal vehicles you might engage in as you're partnering with the federal government. Let's talk about, we always, Justin and I talk about how we do the webinars, and we wanted to give you the good stuff up front. Like, you don't want to wait to the very end of the presentation when everybody's got to run to the next thing before we kind of give you the payload. So what we decided to do was just have a couple slides up front that deliver what we think you really need to walk away from this webinar from. I hope you appreciate that front-loading approach. What are some keys to successful U.S. government collaboration if your company is developing an FDA-regulated small molecule, a biologic, or any class of medical device, or even a combination product? What should you be thinking about as you start the process of engaging? The previous set of slides talked about kind of your entry point. Where do we go to look for opportunities? You go to sam.gov, or you join consortiums and you get on these distribution lists, et cetera. But when it actually comes down to participating in the game, what exactly are we doing? Well, there's almost always a proposal stage. No matter what point of entry you are, what door you're facing, there's a proposal stage. And so it's important for product developers to mark any submissions to the federal government as commercial, confidential, or trade secret, because that allows for the protection of the proprietary information that would go to the government. They're already under an obligation under 18 U.S.C. 1905 not to disclose those, but at the same time, you should have a very thorough marking on everything that you submit to the government. If you are you come to the government regularly for funding, you've participated with the government, it's actually really good to cite previous collaborations with the government. The government likes to fund technology repeatedly through increments, and it kind of reinforces the fact that the previous investment was a good one. So there is a practice of making sure you leverage the previous interactions with the government in the submissions that you're making at this stage in your relationship with the U.S. government. In addition, you want to target a capability gap. One of the challenges I think a lot of our early stage clients have is that they think their product can cover 7 different indications, which that may very well be true. But for the different parts of the R&D elements of the government, each of them have a very different fiscal law framework, and they're funding very specific capability gaps that need to be resolved. And so you may have the best Swiss Army knife in the world, but if you don't actually target a capability gap and submit against a very specific targeted indication or solicitation, you may get overlooked. In addition, as Justin mentioned at the beginning, It's hard to walk and chew gum at the same time. Both the FDA regulated environment and the R&D collaborations with the US government, they both have a certain degree of complexity. And so where you are trying to satisfy both, it can be very different. Where you're trying to partner with, say, the NIH for one indication and the Department of Defense for a second indication, you can oftentimes really get pulled off the ball, and lose really what should be your primary strategic target for the company's commercial success. So be careful not to allow the clamor for the US dollar to get your company off of its strategic goals. We see that happen quite a bit as well. Understand the competitive process, know what game you're playing, know what the competitive procedure is, follow those announcements to the T to increase the probability of success. Um, and of course, know what species of contract vehicle the government is using. It's no secret. Justin and I's practice is very robust in the OT space. I'm not sure there's anywhere else in the whole country that have probably done more OTAs to the level that Justin and I have. We love it because it's such a flexible R&D agreement, but it also isn't appropriate for everything. And oftentimes, you're not going to be able to tell the government what kind of legal vehicle they should be using. So just understand which legal instrument the government is trying to use. See if there's flexibility to move to the more flexible R&D authorities wherever possible.
Mhm. Yeah, and Jeremiah, just one last thought on that final point is sometimes the government is surprisingly willing to change if the performer raises the contract vehicle. I think as you go further into the process, it becomes more difficult, especially if you're getting to the stage of draft contracts. But if it's an issue that's put on the table very early, maybe after the proposal, it's surprising sometimes how often there is flexibility there.
Yeah, no, that's right. And it's interesting. I can just share, some experience over the last 9 months. We've seen kind of a big swing across the government, real heavy early part of the year on OTA consortiums, and a lot of excitement about that leading into in the fall of 24 and into the new administration. We're seeing really a little bit of a pivot to more traditional FAR-D, FAR governed, full and open competitive procedures. So
Mhm.
again, just know what species of instrument you're dealing with here, and pitch the alternatives where you feel like you have an opening. Another thing to think about is that where you are as an FDA regulated product developer may not necessarily dovetail or align completely with the government's acquisition approach. Oftentimes, and I think this is a case across the government, they're increasingly trying to fund things with a smaller rice bowl. And that means that the government may actually be willing to fund a couple increments in maturing your technology. Let's say it's taking it from preclinical to phase one, or phase one into phase 2A or B. Instead of funding the entire product development through licensure, a lot of times the R&D elements of the government don't have the funding power to actually propel something all the way through licensure. There's a caveat to that. A lot of times in the suburban threat countermeasure space, the only place that has money for something like that are the suburban specific elements of the government. That would be BARDA and, for example, JPO within the Department of Defense. I always have my clients, if I'm not directly negotiating with the government, I at least equip the general counsel's office of our clients to make sure they understand the fiscal law considerations that are behind the funding. It's good to know where the funds are coming from, when they expire, what's the urgency in the negotiations. Of course, we're ramping up to the end of the fiscal right now, so this happens a lot. And then within a lot of agencies, they actually have what's called administrative subdivisions. It's a fiscal law issue, but they break it down on basic, applied, and advanced research and development. And knowing kind of what the fiscal law nature of the funds is, what administrative subdivision they have ticketed for your project tells you, have I actually crossed the goal line from an R&D science project, which is propelling the research in the public interest, or have I kind of gone across the goal line? Now I'm in an advanced development relationship with the government where they actually are partnering with me to deliver a solution set to that capability gap. So it's really important to understand the fiscal law background. And of course, who is actually paying for the new drug application, or your BLA, or your PMA as a class 3 device, or a 510K, and who's paying for post-marketing commitments? the incremental funding approach kind of leaves that question open sometimes because they're just funding a piece of it. It's really important to know because, and we'll get to this later, the submission of those documents and the content of those documents are actually very important technical data to protect. And we'll get into that in great detail here. If you have a platform technology, either a molecule that can be repurposed across a number of indications, or perhaps you have a proprietary data set, a biomarker capability, for example, that can be used for a lot of different diagnostic capabilities, then those things need to be protected. Anything that's in the rear view mirror that you're bringing to the collaboration is background IP or data, and you need to protect that. So scoping what is in or out in terms of the potential for the clauses of the contract to apply, that's important. It's important to really understand the background and assert that to the government. And then as it relates to the things that stem from the agreement, what we call subject IP or subject data, it's important to really understand those provisions and negotiate, in particular, precise data rights. There's so much in the FDA regulatory environment that is really data. And a lot of what the government funds in the R&D space is actually funding data development. And so protecting that data is pretty important. And then have a system to mark all your deliverables for the government. If, for example, your entire product platform has been licensed for 10 years and now the government wants to repurpose it for a different indication, that's going to be challenging to mark that because there's so much of it that is entirely yours that the government potentially did not pay for and should not have rights to. So how you mark the deliverables also is very important.
Great. Well, that wraps up our initial overview of the key takeaways. We're going to move now into some more granular discussion of the regulatory framework for FDA regulated medical products. And we're just going to start here. This next chart here probably could be its own hour-long presentation. So we'll try to avoid running down every single detail. But we're going to start with the foundational definitions of drug, biologic, and device. And I think as Jeremiah referenced, this is a really important thing for developers to understand up front. Ideally, you want to understand the framework, the regulatory framework, before you really engage with the government too heavily. Of course, if you've got an early S&T product, that's a little different. But once you're getting into preclinical and clinical studies, you want to know how the FDA is going to regulate your product and then also present the government with a clear path to market. So these are the definitions here. I'm not going to read these entirely, but I will point out really probably the primary distinction here is between drugs and devices. There's a lot of issues there, and sometimes you will get a combination product. And that's actually because the definition of device it entirely includes drugs. So you have basically every device could be regulated as a drug, and then it's regulated as a device if it meets these certain conditions here that are laid out, including the primary intended purpose, which is not achieved by chemical action within or on the body. That's the primary one. And then there also has to be some kind of device mechanism to the product as well. Biologics also have their own definition, which is in Section 262 of Title 42. You'll hear these referred to as large molecule drugs. That's the primary distinction. Is the molecule size between biologics and small molecule drugs. There's several examples that are given here. The jurisdictional lines between drugs and biologics can actually be very complex, as can the question of which of the FDA centers is going to regulate a given product. So, there's a lot more to dive into here for specific products, but the starting point is always these definitions.
Yep. Yeah, right on. Let me just try to give a quick overview, just in 2 slides, of the entire Food and Drug Law framework. Let's see if we can do this. This is really difficult, and Justin did the hardest part. If you can't nail your product classification, it's like a really bad 6th grade math problem where you did the first step in the equation and you did it wrong, and then everything else is wrong. That's kind of what it's like. Product classification first, based on the generally the intended use of the product. But then once you get into this, there are some things that hopefully, as you study this chart, we'll make sure you have a copy of these, that there are some commonalities across the major three medical product categories. There's an investigational phase as you're doing clinical work under an investigational new drug application for both drugs and biologics. There's an equivalent IDE for devices. Those would be significant risk devices. There's huge exemptions in the device space where you don't even need an IDE. But then once you move through your research phase, your clinical phase, then you're getting into what we would call your pre-market approval phase, where you're actually filing applications to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So for drugs and biologics, it's very similar. They would have a full-scale application with full reports of safety and efficacy. We call that the 505(b)(1) NDA for drugs and the 351A biologics license application for biologics. A class 3 high risk device is going to be a PMA under Section 515 of the FD&C Act. And then, you have what's called abbreviated approval mechanisms, and each category has their own ways to abbreviate. And we're not going to camp on a lot of these. We will talk quite a bit about 505(b)(2) here in just a few minutes, but generic drugs are essentially bioequivalent copies of B1 drugs. So those are what we call ANDAs. That's under 505J of the FD&C Act. In the biologic sphere, we actually now have two different types of biosimilar applications since 2010. We'll talk a little bit about those. And then, believe it or not, the 510(k) pre-market notice procedure, which most of us are really familiar with, it is actually an abbreviated approval application because it's based on a predicate device. So very similar theories about how to get to market by building on what's already known about a predecessor product. Every category has some way to expedite products that are treating an unmet medical need, or maybe there is some initial clinical evidence that suggests that it really is a breakthrough capability. That principle goes across all three product categories, and there are expedited approval mechanisms for each one. And there are also alternative approval pathways. We don't have a lot of time to dig into this, but Justin and I do a lot of accelerated approval under 21 CFR 314 subpart H. We probably do more animal rule product development than anybody in the entire country, 21 CFR 314 subpart I and the corresponding biologics provision, where it's infeasible or unethical to have field trials for subburn threat indications. De novo is a very unique alternative pathway in the device world where we're looking to actually get the agency to classify a novel product that doesn't quite fit, doesn't maybe have a class 2 predicate. And then there are incentives that go all the way across the board for all three categories. There is some incentives related to very limited class 3 data for PMA devices, but by and large, exclusivity, priority review vouchers, patent term restorations, these incentives are usually driven by the drug and device biologics paradigm. And then this is all of the material that most of us understand as giving us really big compliance obligations. There's manufacturing standards, there are registration and listing obligations, there's labeling obligations for each of these categories. And even after approval, there are post-approval obligations for adverse event reporting, post-market change reporting. And that's not even to get to the idea of post-market or what we call phase 4 post-market requirements or post-market commitments. So in very summary form, we've just summarized the entire body of food and drug law on just a couple slides to kind of give you a little bit of a spider sense of how this entire framework is going to apply to your medical product.
Now we're going to go into a little more detail on the drug and biologic regulatory framework. And I think this is actually a really useful starting point, and trying to keep this in mind throughout the product development is helpful. What is the end goal here? What is the legal standard for drug approval? And this is what you're going to have to show to substantiate an NDA or a BLA submission to the agency. It starts with providing adequate tests of safety for the drug, and then also efficacy. Those are the two primary components that have to be met, demonstrating safety and efficacy of the drug. How do you do that? You do that through providing substantial evidence that it has the effect that you're representing that it has. And that ties into the product labeling, as Jeremiah just shared the regulations there. And then really the other key part for drug approval is the manufacturing and the processing of the drug to make sure that it is adequate strength, quality, and purity. Those are the CGMP regulations that apply there. So all of that needs to be locked down before the NDA or BLA is submitted and included in that submission. And then kind of the last point here is the evidentiary standard that we have in Section 505D is substantial evidence. And this is kind of the key phrase here is adequate and well-controlled investigations, as I'm sure you've all heard. And that actually has been somewhat of an evolving standard over the last 20 or 30 years. There's been some new opportunities recently to have introduction of real-world evidence, but really this is, the gold standard is going to be a double-blind clinical trial. That's what we all think of with at least two arms. And that's going to be what's necessary to support approval of the drug or biologic. Before you get to any of that, the first stage here is going to be preclinical testing. This is the primary goal of this is to substantiate whether you've got any potential efficacy for the drug or biologic, and then B, if you've actually got some preliminary reads on safety that are going to be sufficient to justify human clinical trials. So these are the goals here, looking at toxic effects, starting to think about an initial safe starting dose, and then just sketching out what kind of adverse effects you would expect to see, and thinking at an ethical level whether the potential benefit could outweigh the effects, and then just really thinking ahead your clinical studies. How do you design the clinical studies to control for those effects to ensure that you've got a safe study for humans? There's two kinds of preclinical testing. You've got in vitro, which is in the glass, on the glass, and then in vivo, which is in the body, typically animal testing. We didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings, so we have a rat or a mouse there, but it can involve other cuter animals as well. Once you've got the preclinical testing, you're going to bundle that together and file an investigational new drug application, an IND. And really legally, the IND serves as an exemption from the ban on interstate transport of unapproved new drugs that's in the FD&C Act. So that gets you around that. It's a pretty robust submission, I think, as everybody's tracking. And there's three types of INDs. So there's the investigator IND, which is really probably the most usual one that you'll see. There's the emergency use IND, which is for investigational product that's actually being deployed for emergency purposes or expanded use. And there's a treatment IND, which is similar. This is for products that are fairly far along, and they're showing some benefit if you've got a serious or life-threatening condition. The goal there is to get the product to patients while you're still working on the final FDA approval of the NDA or the BLA. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but just for everybody's awareness, the IND is driven by the form FDA 1571, walks through all the elements there. As you can see, it's a pretty robust submission.
And Justin, just one more thing here before we get to Chris Farley. We should just leave this up for a few seconds and let everybody
Sure.
enjoy that.
Sure.
It's just even when you're transferring assets, so a lot of you guys out there are undertaking tech transfer in or out licensing of technology. The transfer of INDs require a complete resubmission of the 1571 for each IND and letters of transfer. And so, this form's important, and there's mechanics to each step of this.
Yeah, great note. And now I can get to Chris Farley because, it's exciting. Once you've got your IND, once you've got your safe to proceed letter, or the FDA hasn't said anything for 30 days, then it's go time. Let's roll with clinical trials.
It's go time. It's go time. Well, I'm going to walk through this as best as I can, but it is a little bit of a complicated framework. But most folks understand when in this space when we talk about a phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3 trial that would be under the IND framework. Phase 1 generally is your initial investigations into safety. Again, we're assuming our preclinical in vitro and in vivo work is done. Now we're in the clinic. Phase 2 is where you begin to look at initial efficacy and perhaps do dose ranging studies to understand that what we really think is the most efficacious dose in a human. We're looking at a minimum and a maximum tolerated dose. or minimum effective dose. That's where you're looking for your Cmax, your areas under the curve, all of your analyses that go into picking that dose. Then you get to what we call the phase 3 pivotal trial. You'll never find the word pivotal anywhere in FDA's regulations, but that's the word we use. It's where you're actually looking for to complete a home run, large scale efficacy study to prove that the product is effective for the intended label indication. And just to foot stomp this, the agency's approval decisions are really a risk benefit calculus. Do the known benefits outweigh the known risks for the very specific and precisely tailored indication that the applicant is submitted? Then, once you're done, you package all of this up in an NDA submission, and hopefully you have the dance party reflected here on the right side of the slide, where you actually have an approval decision. We all know that it's a little more complicated than that. You could have a refuse to file letter. You could have a deficiency letter. You could have a lot of things that trip up the agency's review ultimately in the approval decision. But even when you do get an NDA or a BLA approved, there is oftentimes now phase 4 post-marketing commitments under Section 505(o) of the FD&C Act, which are all baked into the Food, Drug, and Administration Amendments Act of 2007. And uniquely, and this is relevant for those of you interested in partnering with the government perhaps to repurpose drugs, only the sponsor of an NDA or the holder of an NDA or BLA has the right to supplement. Everybody else has got to use an abbreviated approval mechanism. But if you are supplementing your application to add a new indication, you actually get to participate in this kind of do loop that's reflected on the slide, because you can actually go back into the clinic and study something in new phase 2B or phase 3 trials and actually supplement your label much faster than somebody starting from scratch trying to rely to some degree, hopefully off patent, on what you've done in an abbreviated approval context.
Great. And before we move to the next slide, just quick admin announcement. I'm going to give the CLE code for today's presentation. The code is considerations 2025. Again, that's considerations 2025. There's no space between considerations and 2025, if that matters.
All right, good luck. I hope you got it. All right, now we can't go into every kind of product category. I wish, honestly, I mean, we could do this for like 2 days. We love teaching this material, love everything about both of these kind of complicated systems. But one area of the NDA approval pathways that is often overlooked, we've got the 505(b)(1) NDA, the full-scale application for novel product development, new active moieties. We've got, on the other hand, the 505J ANDA approach for bioequivalent copies for generic drugs. But in the middle, there's a little bit of a hybrid. And this is what we would call a 505(b)(2) NDA. It was added by Hatch-Waxman in 1984, the same statute that gives us generic drugs. But it also allows for approval based on investigations for which the sponsor is relying but does not have a right of reference. They can also depend, like most abbreviated applicants, on what we would call an RLD, or a reference listed drug. But really, the statute doesn't formally require a reference listed drug in a 505(b)(2) NDA. It just means that there's something in the dossier that the sponsor doesn't have a right of reference to. And the agency can allow a sponsor under 505(b)(2) to rely on 3 buckets of information: new clinical data, which is always acceptable, published literature, or FDA's prior safety and efficacy determination for the listed drug. And of course, how you weigh and balance those 3 buckets can be very difficult and challenging. But 505(b)(2), particularly for repurposing efforts, is a very powerful NDA submission route to market. And when we get to the biologics world, so we're kind of jumping into another space here, the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act of 2009 was the first statutory framework that gave us abbreviated approvals for biologics. When I was in the chief counsel's office and when I was in the commissioner's office at FDA, we really struggled with whether or not, prior to the BPCIA, whether the agency had approval to authorize abbreviated approvals of biologics. Many of you might remember the struggle over follow-on protein products with Omnitrope in 2006, a bunch of other back and forth with the Hill, and FDA repeatedly basically said to Congress, we don't have authority even though biologics are drugs and maybe there's some connectivity to the FDA&C Act, the Public Health Service Act, where biologics are licensed, 351A, did not have an abbreviated capability. So Congress added that in the BPCIA, and we'll talk about two types of applications for biosimilars. The first one is just your straightforward biosimilar, where you're trying to prove that your product is highly similar to a reference listed biologic where there's no clinically meaningful differences between the reference product. Of course, they're not generics, they're not the same. These are large molecules and they are very complicated to characterize fully. They phosphorylate, there's glycosylation, there's different components to these kind of very large molecules. And so it's very difficult for folks to understand, but they're not generics. These are simply biosimilar. They're not biosames. And the other thing, and this has been a little bit of a controversial point, the statute includes a different standard for interchangeable biosimilars. Those interchangeable biosimilars still have to meet the underlying threshold of biosimilarity, but it also the sponsor has to prove that the product can be expected to have the same clinical results as the reference product in any given patient, and there's no additional risk of switching between the reference product and the interchangeable product. This is pretty disputed. Lot of heat on this one, just because in the last 2 years, the agency has actually told Congress that it doesn't think that this distinction is any longer relevant in the biosimilar space. And of course, you've got the trade groups in the private sector up in arms because a lot of companies have invested a lot of money in terms of trying to get the interchangeable label for their biosimilar. And also, there's an exclusivity connection to interchangeability. You get 1 year of marketing exclusivity, whereas mere biosimilarity doesn't actually give you any incentive at all. And so this is a kind of a big ticket. We expect Congress to act here sometime soon. And I think, knowing my involvement all the way back into the early 2000s with biosimilars and this was actually a very heated debate. And this interchangeability standard was actually intended to be a higher bar by Congress's activity in the BPCIA. So it's very interesting to see now the agency essentially saying there's no big differences here between the two standards, and increasingly people kind of agreeing with that position. I'm not sure it's 100% accurate, but we're going to see how this plays out. It's important to understand, just because you, in product development, as Justin said, you try to begin with the end in mind. Everything that you are generating is technical data, and you are going to have to format it and organize it all in a completely systematized way. This is called the Electronic Common Technical Document. There are different modules that you begin to populate. Even an IND has to begin being built with these modules in mind under the eCTD format. And even when you file everything electronically these days, there is actually an entire framework that governs how those documents have to be built. So it's not just as easy as kind of writing a Word document and throwing it over to the agency. The eCTD framework is the thing to keep in mind, because eventually everything that you draft and put into that regulatory dossier is going to have to be in this format. Believe it or not, why are two Washington, D.C. lawyers talking to you about FDA and GovCon, and now we have slides about meetings? This seems so boring. But believe it or not, this is actually a huge part of our practice. We help companies facilitate engagements with the agency, and frankly, there's no 1-800 number to get to your review division. This is the formal way. That is an on-the-record engagement with the agency, whereby you can actually get some insight from the review divisions, whether it's within the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, or CDRH, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. Those are the folks that you need to weigh in on your product, your FDA regulatory strategy. And there are often very important questions about how to do the development that need to be answered. Most of us are very familiar with type A, B, and C meetings. These have been around forever. Type B is kind of your pre-IND all the way through the normal incremental steps of product development. Type A is where there's a real stalled effort. We do a lot of special protocol assessments for animal rule products, but there's some kind of dispute. There's something hanging it up. And a Type C is a much broader kind of catch-all, kind of soup to nuts. Let's evaluate some where we are in our data package kind of meeting. But there's a couple others under the PDUFA 7 framework. The prescription drug user fee negotiations always produce what's called the commitment letter. Some of you guys could Google PDUFA 7 commitment letter, and that's actually where you find the center's newest and latest ideas on how to engage with the agency. So coming out of the last PDUFA negotiations, you now have a formalized interact capability, which means these are very early stage pre-IND engagements with either CDER or CBER that allow you to kind of accelerate your first in human capability. And then there's also a Type D, which is actually such common sense here, because sometimes you leave the agency's meetings, even when you've negotiated the minutes at the very end of them. It's a whole package with questions followed by a briefing document, followed by the actual conversations, followed by minutes. It's a very on the record procedure. But even after that, there's always a couple questions that you just wish you could fire back to that review division. Well, the Type D meeting request allows for those kind of very narrow, no more than 2 follow-up questions to get some clarity on something that was a part of the earlier piece there. So that's an overview of the meetings. Important, but as simple as it sounds, they're very important.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremiah. And one other just quick note here with this topic is that this is actually a key area to think if you're in the context of a government contract about your government team's involvement in the meetings. Oftentimes, it can be a big advantage to have government folks that can speak to the government's interest in the context of these different types of meetings. And another contracting consideration is just thinking about how you're going to build that into the terms. Oftentimes, it can be just good to avoid any ambiguity on how these meetings are going to run, who's going to be invited. Those are all things that you can answer clearly in your contract to avoid later issues. I'm going to hop over now to talk a little bit about devices. I'm going to move pretty quickly here, but I should have said this at the get-go. These slides are going to be available on the website after the presentation, and I think they'll also go out by email. So don't worry, a lot of this is for reference, but I do want to give just a quick overview. We don't want to sell devices short here. So, pop quiz, which of these are actually a medical device? The answer is actually all of them could be. And that's because there's a pretty expansive
I wore my smartwatch, buddy, just for you, man.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Yeah, the Apple Watch is an FDA regulated medical device. So it's a really huge and evolving category. In terms of the classification, so there's 3 classes of medical devices. General controls are going to apply to all classes of device, and these are listed here. Registration listing, reporting adverse events, the QMS, post-market surveillance, apply across the board. Then you've got class 1 medical devices, which are the lowest risk class. And for class 1 devices, usually the only thing that's going to apply is general controls. These are typically exempt from a pre-market submission, a 510K. There are a few class 1 devices where a 510K is required. Class 2, this is kind of the sweet spot for a lot of device manufacturers. These are medium complexity medical devices. As Jeremiah covered earlier, this is actually an abbreviated application that is relying on a prior determination of safety and efficacy by FDA. So for class 2 medical devices, you're going to have general controls and special controls that are going to apply. There are a handful of exempt class 2 devices that don't require a 510K. Most of them will require a 510K. And then at the bottom of this slide, we've got the definition of special controls. This is the extra piece that applies in addition to the, I'm sorry, special controls. This is the extra piece that applies in addition to general controls that are device specific and ensure that there can be safe use of the device. Class 3 is the most complex, highest risk device. This is also the default classification for new devices for which there's nothing currently on the market that could be cited as a predicate. Um, and of course, for these devices, the FDA is going to give the highest level of scrutiny, which means that you're going to have general controls, special controls, and then you're also going to have to submit a pre-market approval application, a PMA, under Section 515 of the FD&C Act, which is the most robust pre-market submission for devices. Um, just briefly, in investigational device exemptions. This is akin to an IND for devices. This is required only for significant risk device studies, which, as Jeremiah alluded to, this actually carves out a lot of studies that can be done that are non-significant risk. So those don't require an IDE. That determination is made by the IRB before the study starts, but also subject to FDA review. So you have to be a little bit careful there to make sure that as a sponsor that you're agreeing with the determination. The PMA application, as I mentioned, this is for Class 3 devices. Not going to go into too much detail here, but it is really analogous to a 505(b)(1) or a 351A BLA application, very robust. You're almost certainly going to have to submit clinical data to support use of the device. The 510(k) pre-market notification, the primary burden that has to be met here is showing that the new device is substantially equivalent to a predicate device. And this is appropriate when a full PMA isn't required, when there's no exemption. Um, and then really when you have a predicate, that's the first question is there a viable predicate that you can cite? Those are really the hallmarks of a 510(k). And this is more information here about the legal definition of predicate and substantial equivalence, which is the burden that you have to meet. Okay, de novo review. Jeremiah also mentioned this earlier. This is a relatively new type of classification. In essence, what you're doing with the de novo is down classifying a new device. So as I mentioned a minute ago, if you've got a device, it's the first of their kind, there's nothing on the market. The default is it's going to be a Class 3 medical device. What you can do is the sponsor can actually submit a de novo submission to the FDA where you're in essence advocating for a lower class, typically a Class 2, sometimes a Class 1, which is based on the risk assessment of the device. And if you're successful, this will get the sponsor out of the requirement to file a full PMA. Usually, a de novo is typically going to require some amount of clinical data. So again, it's still a fairly high burden, but it doesn't require a full PMA. Okay. I'm just going to say a quick word here about combination products. So combination products is when you have more than one type of classification. Typically, it would be a drug device or a biologic device combination product, but there can also be drug biologic combinations. The FDA will evaluate these types of applications and assign them to a lead center within the agency. And it does that by looking at the primary mode of action, the PMOA. Um, so, so the centers are going to work together. If you've got a drug device combination product, CDER is going to be working with CDRH throughout the process, but the one that's the lead center is going to be driving the review of the application, and that's also going to dictate what type of application is submitted. So if it's CDER lead, it's going to be an NDA ultimately that's required. Request for designation this is a way that sponsors can get a pre-read on what on product classification. This is submitted under 21 CFR Part 3. Not going to go into too much detail here. I'd like to kick it over to Jeremiah, though. I think this next section is actually very relevant for our discussion here on expedited approval mechanisms and
Yeah.
regulatory incentives.
As you guys move forward to your application phase, it's actually really important to evaluate expedited approval mechanisms so you understand how the agency might move your product forward. And as I mentioned before, generally speaking, whether it's fast track or breakthrough therapy device, priority review, RMAT, or military medical product priority, all of them have to deal with some level of unmet medical need, some initial evidence that the product could be a substantial improvement over what's existing. I will say that the agency's guidance on expedited approval mechanisms is outstanding. It really does compare each of the legal standards for all of these. And we mentioned some of the kind of special approval pathways, accelerated approval, animal rule. We do a lot of EUA work, especially from our DoD backgrounds. We've supported EUAs quite a bit. I do want to mention a couple things as we progress through here, because there are a couple expedited approval mechanisms and voucher programs related to this issue of priority review that you may not be aware of. So we'll touch on a couple of these as well, but pay attention to those. This is a great laydown, actually, from one of our friends at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research who put this together. That just kind of lays out how you optimize the use of expedited approval mechanisms across the continuum of your product development. So here you see when you would ask for breakthrough designation or fast track. Here's where you would begin to explore accelerated approval capabilities when you ask for priority review, et cetera. So great laydown. You can look at that in the slide deck. One thing that a lot of folks still are not aware of, even though the statute is almost, it's almost 10 years old now, getting there, is Public Law 11592 allows for the Department of Defense to request that the agency expedite its review and approval of any product development that the DoD considers to be a priority for the unique needs of the warfighter. I helped negotiate and draft the statute with the former commissioner of FDA and the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs. It was all driven by some issues related to French freeze-dried plasma, but the sum total of this statute is that it allows for the agency to have its own, the DoD to have its own expedited approval mechanism that is above and beyond anything else that the agency has in the FD&C Act. It also uniquely expanded DoD's emergency use authorization, which is very relevant to a lot of our clients who are aiming to partner with the Department of Defense. This is actually, for those of you who are out there partnering with DoD or aiming to partner with the DoD, I encourage you to check out the links on the slides here to our client alert, to the webpage at MRDC that we drafted. Literally, Justin and I worked on the statute itself, but we actually drafted the implementing MOU with DoD and FDA, as well as the internal DoD charter that governs how this system operates.
Yeah, and that last link there is to the FDA's webpage on PL 11592. That's interesting and useful because during the process of reviewing DoD priority products, of course, all that's confidential between the agencies. It's not public. But what FDA has done is after the products are approved or cleared, they've got a running list on their website. And if you go there, you can actually see some examples of product development that has been shifted to the left significantly in some cases. Products that Jeremiah and I worked on, for example, may have required an additional phase 3 study that was moved upon agreement with FDA to a post-marketing requirement. So that's one example that probably saved a couple of years, but there's others like it. Anyway, that link's there on the slide if you want to look at it.
Yeah, that's great. The other area here that Justin and I kind of specialize in is priority review voucher programs. There are actually 3 distinct programs for tropical diseases, rare pediatric diseases, as well as material threat medical countermeasures. If a product is qualifying under any of these statutes, it actually the company who gets this approval in one of these 3 categories can receive a very powerful regulatory tool called a priority review voucher. Think of the Disney Fast Pass or the Aladdin Genie. But if you get it, it allows you to either go faster at the FDA the next time with your subsequent product, regardless of indication, or it allows you to sell that voucher to a third party. And some of those vouchers have sold anywhere between 55 million up to 350 million. Right now, I think the market's around 155 million on voucher sales. 2 of the statutes actually have expired, and Congress is working to reauthorize them. The tropical disease PRV program is permanent. So I have a diagram here that just kind of shows you how this works a little bit. But this is pretty complex, but it is certainly a lot of fun. And I think the reason these incentives exist is to drive investment into underserved product development spaces like tropical diseases, rare peds, MCMs for suburban threat countermeasures. There's just not enough of a return on investment for the private market to drive investment in these areas. And so these statutes are very important. I've had a hand in all three of them. Justin and I do a lot of work across the PRV space.
Great. Okay, so with our remaining just a few minutes here, we're going to loop back to government contracts. We just gave you a lot of information. How do you take that and actually use that when you're negotiating and administering government contracts? So, our focus here, we really try to keep this pretty simple. If you think of a stool with three legs, the first leg that you're going to have that's going to be really important is intellectual property. The second one is going to be the data rights in the contract. And the third one is the regulatory rights. So that's really where we focus a lot of our legal review. And we counsel our clients to focus a lot of their time as well. As mentioned earlier, this all starts with understanding the FDA regulation of the product, and then filters down to choosing hopefully the most flexible legal instrument that's permissible, because that's going to help you land on better terms in all of those areas. Not going to talk too much about buy-dole rights, but this is kind of a threshold issue. This information's here for reference. It's really an important question as you get into the contracting process of whether buy-dole rights will apply to the endeavor. They don't apply to every type of government contract. Here's the scope. It applies to contracts, which is really FAR contracts, grants, cooperative agreements. Notably, it does not apply to other transaction authority agreements, although a lot of contracting or agreement officers will try to basically impute buy-dole rights into those agreements. And there's kind of like a push-pull with buy-dole rights that concern subject inventions as well as the rights in joint inventions. It's actually pretty good bargain for the companies. The government will typically get a non-exclusive license. The thing to be aware of is the potential for margin rights, which is always the boogeyman that does attach to any buy-dole subject inventions. And then there's requirements for disclosure under buy-dole. This is just listed here. Got to make sure that you do this, or else the government could have rights to the invention.
Yeah. Yeah, and as I mentioned, most of your FDA regulated development is about development of safety and efficacy data, and all that's going to be technical data governed under very specific provisions in your government contract relationship. And there's actually a whole continuum of the kinds of rights that the government could get. Generally speaking, the government's going to look for government purpose rights where there's joint funding, and the government would have the right to use that for any government purposes short of commercialization. What we get concerned about is where we see the government aiming for unlimited rights. Typically, they get unlimited rights in data where they've paid for 100% of the development, but they can use it for anything, including transfer to a third-party entity who may or may not be your competitor. Limited rights or restricted rights are those things that have been developed with private expense for which there can be markings and restricted disclosures to the government. They're only allowed to review it, see it within the government, and oftentimes they can't even transfer limited rights material to approved government support contractors. There's some ability to do that in a very limited way, but that's the continuum of rights here. Why is this so important? It's important because the framework of the contract is going to specify for each deliverable what's the kind of rights that are associated with that particular item. So you can go to the next slide.
And just since we're at the top of the hour, I'm going to give the CLE code one more time.
Yeah, good call.
Again, yeah, the code is Considerations 2025. That's Considerations 2025 with no space. We've just got a couple slides here, and then we'll wrap.
Yep, landing the plane here. So this is important to get all of this right, because your FDA regulatory rights within the GovCon space, that agreement's going to have to specify who's the sponsor. You don't want to have any ambiguity about who is in control of the relationship between the company and the agency. And oftentimes the government doesn't want to be the sponsor. Sometimes it will be, but you need to lock that down. There will be terms that require the product developer to share its communications with the agency. Oftentimes the government may want to participate, and to be honest, that's actually to your advantage. So usually it's a good thing. Sometimes the government will ask for rights of reference to technology or broad rights of references, maybe a little bit of an overreach, but certainly that's something that you can negotiate with whichever agency you're potentially partnering with. As you go through these GovCon terms, you're going to see GXP requirements, either in vivo good laboratory practices for your animal work. If it's clinical work, the government's funding that's going to have to meet the GCP standard. If they're manufacturing and delivering end products, then obviously you're going to see CGMP obligations. Sometimes the government will put in some pretty exotic provisions about putting a man in your manufacturing plant, giving the government notice of any sort of negative 483 or EIR outcomes related to inspections, et cetera. I think sometimes the biggest challenge is making sure that you have enough time to remediate any problem that may happen in the course of performance from a regulatory perspective. Oftentimes, it's just very complicated to discern what's the problem, what's the right corrective action or preventative action that you should institute.
Great. And one other thing just to note here briefly, which is clawback clauses. We're going to kind of skip over this. The information's here. This is something to look out for, which is basically transferring rights back to the government, including regulatory rights if there's a development failure. So just be on the lookout for that. We've got the slide there. Do want to get just to our final thoughts though, as we're now past the hour.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeremiah.
Yep, and we've said it before. Again, FDA regulated medical product development is data driven. So will be your R&D agreement. So pay attention to your data rights. As Justin said, lock down your regulatory strategy. Doesn't mean you can't have different lines of effort and different options down the road, but it's important to understand that your strategy is aligned with the U.S. government's need, and be careful of getting drawn off course to do things that really aren't in the company's commercial strategic best interest. Pay attention to the three big areas within each agreement: intellectual property, technical data, and your FDA regulatory rights. And finally, we will you can go on to the next one there.
That's the end.
Yeah, that's it. Hey, I think we're done.
Yeah,
Okay,
we reached it.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
that's the big one. Okay, well, hey,
Yeah,
we did it,
that's right.
guys. We did it.
Yep. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We do have a few questions here, and I think probably what's best due to timing is we'll just follow up with the folks that submitted them. Although there was one I can answer on the fly, which was, is a hip implant really a class 2 device? Yes, it is. It's kind of amazing, actually. Hips and knees, that's actually how I started my career working with a device manufacturer. So yeah, those are typically class 2 devices. And it is just generally, it is kind of interesting. There are some very advanced devices that are class 2. So yeah, if you're ever having difficulty falling asleep, read through the 800 CFRs. You'll find some interesting product classifications.
All right.
But again, our contact info is here. We'll push out these slides to you folks. We really do appreciate you all taking the time to be with us today. And again, if you've got any questions, feel free to follow up with us at the email addresses or phone numbers here.